Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. This week, we report from the Rural Futures Conference held here in Lincoln, where we talked with IANR Harlan Vice Chancellor Ronnie Green and Angler Agribusiness Entrepreneurship Chair Tom Field. Galen Erickson will show us how UNL researchers are making ground corn stalks more effective, and Roy Smith is our marketing analyst. The USDA released projected numbers for the 2012 crop on Thursday morning. The agency projects a record U.S. corn crop of 14.8 billion bushels, with average yield at a historic 166 bushels per acre. The USDA expects U.S. farmers to produce 3.2 billion bushels of soybeans for the 2012-2013 crop due to higher yield. We talked with Roy Smith on Wednesday afternoon before markets reacted to releases.
It's been a week that a lot of different things have happened in the commodity markets. Some good, some not so good, and some absolutely awful. So, you kind of pick your poison, and that's where you land.
One of the things that's playing in, at least to some extent, is elections over in Europe. This is playing a part, but how big of a part does it play when it comes to grains?
I think it's a real big part right now. We've seen the effect of the South American crop shortage being a bullish factor in the grain markets for months.
Right.
And that's not new news anymore, although how that report this week ends up being will be important. But I think what is important is that people keep expecting the Europeans to do something about the problem, and all they seem to be willing to do is try to ignore it and kick the can down the road, so to speak. And these elections really sort of put a deadline on what's going on there, and people are realizing that, hey, maybe this isn't going to be all that easy to solve.
The seasonal trends you say are still in play. Explain that to me.
It was really interesting. It's been an interesting year, starting clear back in November and December, when the seasonal trends turn from short to long after the harvest, and we see that what I call the dead cat bounce. In the last 3 or 4 years, that dead cat bounce has just continued to go clear on up into spring. And I do some research, sort of hands-on cash and carry research with soybean futures market, and that was one of the best bullish moves I've seen in 15 years, and it peaked out exactly when the long-term chart said it should, which would have been the last week in April. So those trends are really holding pretty much true to form. Sometimes it's hard for people to take action based on them, but it's usually a good idea.
In that case, tell me what the seasonal trends predict next, because in this second week of May, things haven't been as bright.
That's true, and when I look at those long-term seasonal price trend charts, I see a peak the last week in April, and then a kind of a swoon for a few days, and then another small peak the first week second week in May, and then you see it trend down into the early part of June, and then a rally in the middle of June. Now, the rally in the middle of June can be a little deceptive, because there was 1 year in there, 2008, when we had a huge run-up in price the middle of June, and that sort of distorts the whole picture. So when I'm talking about clues for when to pull the trigger on making sales, I say you start the middle of April and go through somewhere around the first week in June, and that'll, a lot of years that gets your highest price that you have available that year.
Let me quickly ask you about corn. On the futures, the December contract is flirting with $5. Cash is going to be below that, but how compelled do you feel to contract for that number?
I think that the December corn probably has got the biggest part of the big crop bid into it, and I'm not really excited about selling at a price that really is break even or a little less than break even for a farmer, depending on whether he's cash renting or whether he owns the land and so forth. You know, I would like to see the corn market come back, the new crop corn market come back before making sales. Now, I split the new crop and old crop there because the old crop, we've got some of the best basis in history right now. And my feeling on old crop corn is sell something, because you're taking advantage of some of the best basis in the last 10 years. New crop, I'm not really wanting to sell at this price. If we could squeeze 50 cents or $1 out of it, I might be willing to.
Next week, we'll look at cattle markets with Mike Briggs. The Humane Society of the United States released a video this week that they say was taken at Wyoming Premium Farms in Wheatland, Wyoming. HSUS says an undercover worker at the sow unit recorded the video in April. In it, alleged workers are seen kicking sows and throwing piglets, among other things. For instances such as this, the Center for Food Integrity created a panel to review and comment on videos of alleged animal abuse. The panel is composed of 3 members: Dr. Temple Grandin from Colorado State, Dr. John Dean from the University of Minnesota's College of Veterinary Medicine, and Dr. Candace Croney from Purdue University. We talked with Dr. Croney after the panel released its report.
The egregious level of handling and obvious abusive treatment of that animal was inexcusable, indefensible, and possibly one of the saddest things I've had to look at in recent history, which is saying a lot. It should never happen, and we all need to work a lot harder to make sure that that kind of thing isn't going on.
Do you think it's beneficial for producers to watch the video?
I have to warn people, it's a very hard video to watch. I think anybody involved in livestock production that thinks these things really do not happen, and understandably there's some people who have concerns that maybe this is a staged video. That's always one of the concerns when a video like this is released. But putting that aside for now, however that treatment of animals happened, whether it was staged or not, absolutely unacceptable. And I think it would benefit producers to see some of the things that people are complaining about and thinking about are the standard of animal care today in modern swine production. The one thing I'd like to add is for the people who watch that video and think that that is the standard on our swine farms in the U.S. in terms of animal care, that's not standard. That is absolutely the antithesis of all industry standards in terms of appropriate animal care and handling. We're working on these problems. There are always going to be some actors out there that don't follow the script, that don't do the right thing. And when these things happen, I think it's really important that we all stand up and condemn that sort of inappropriate, inexcusable behavior and take steps to ensure that they are fewer and fewer to the point where we get none of these cases occurring.
Croney says it's critical for producers to know the best standards of care and management for animals and to educate and supervise workers on the farm. The Associated Press reports that law enforcement officials are working with the Wyoming Livestock Board to investigate allegations of mistreatment and if charges should be filed. The Rural Futures Institute is a system-wide effort from the University of Nebraska. This week, the university held a conference in Lincoln designed to bring together local, state, national, and international stakeholders interested in the future of rural America. We talked with University of Nebraska Vice President and IANR Harlan Vice Chancellor Ronnie Green on the opening night of the conference about the Institute and what role agriculture plays in planning for the future.
We've been talking at the university now for a little over a year about how we take what we have been doing related to what I'd call rural development. We have had a rural initiative at the university for about the last 10 years. And thinking about whether that's enough, whether we should be doing more, whether we should be looking more comprehensively at the issue of changing rural demographics long term. And what's come out of that discussion is the idea that we're considering forming a new institute across the whole university system, all of our campuses involved, that focuses on what the long-term rural outlook might need to look like. And is that long-term rural outlook the same as what we've thought about in the past, which is kind of couched in the way that the landscape was settled after the Homestead Act and the way towns were distributed. Think of it in Nebraska, for example, how towns followed the railroads and the river and later the highway system. What is that long-term sustainable, or is there a different model out there that we might be thinking about long-term? So this institute has as its focus, can the university bring together people across disciplines, whether that be in healthcare, or whether that be in education, or whether that be in extension in agriculture, or whether that be in the legal industry, or in finance and banking and the finance industries. Can we bring those groups together in a way that focus on what does all of that mean long-term for young people to want to come back to rural communities, and for those to look sustainable in the long term. So that's the idea of this new institute.
What role does agriculture play in that? Certainly this show is geared towards agriculture, but I think those in rural communities also know that it's not the only thing. What role do you see agriculture playing in this?
Well, if you think historically, we've always thought, for a long time, let's say, we thought rural and agriculture were hand in hand. They were the same thing. So a rural community was based around farming or ranching or the ag production industry. That's still largely true, and it'll still, I think, be largely true for the long term. But if we're successful in the university, and a lot of the things that you talk about on Market Journal on a weekly basis are things that we're doing to continue to innovate agriculture, to continue to apply new technology to livestock production or crop production or biofuels and alternative energy sources production. If we're successful in that, and the research we do matters, and we translate that into new technology, we're going to continue to see agriculture change, right? So we're going to continue to see maybe fewer people involved in production agriculture and larger scale units, just like we've seen for decades that development occur. So agriculture will always be there. It'll always be central because it's land-based, right? But in order for it to be sustainable and long-term successful, you have to have other infrastructure around the people that are still engaged in production agriculture for rural landscapes to be healthy and to be successful. So that's what this is really about in this discussion.
For people in rural areas, what can they do to help?
Well, we're here at this conference the next couple of days, and we had a great discussion here in the opening of it tonight, listening to young people who are engaged back in rural communities, talking about what will those need to look like for them to want to be there, for them to see them as successful and sustainable. And they talked a lot about community and place and the desire to be in a place and to be across generations in a way that you don't always get in an urban environment even. So that's one element of it. So people in rural places, people in rural communities, I think we're talking about a re-engaged leadership, about really having a commitment to what the long-term future can look like, which requires you, of course, to maybe give up a little bit of what the past has been. Every town's not going to survive. The question is, does every town need to survive? There's some of those kind of hard questions that we have to address in thinking about, for this given area, what does that area look like 50 years from now?
Let me ask you this to close out. What is success in your mind? And obviously it's an ambitious goal. It's a long-term goal, I'm sure. What is success for this institute?
I think success is that through a different way of approaching the land-grant mission. And that's part of what we're talking about here. This is a different way of approaching what we've thought of as our traditional land-grant mission. That we would see rural landscapes that would grow in population, that would become younger in median age, that would have economic health and prosperity in those communities, including built around agriculture and natural resource use, so that compared to where we are today, that we feel like that we turned the corner on rural landscape sustainability instead of kind of feeling like, what do we do to survive?
We'll have more from the conference later in the show with Angler Agribusiness Entrepreneurship Chair Tom Field. For grain farmers, high-priced corn, when sold as such, improves the bottom line. But cattle producers using corn as an input shoulder the expensive price tag. At the ARDC in Meade this week, we talked with UNL Extension beef feedlot specialist Galen Erickson about the research that could lower costs for feeders.
There's been a lot of interest because we're seeing an increase in grain prices. So there's a lot of interest in what can we do as ways to offset that increased grain. So ironically, we normally use this in feedlot diets as a rough feed source at 5% of the diet. And now we're looking at ways to increase inclusion and make it as competitive as we can to corn.
What can you add to it to make it better?
There's been a lot of work done in the past, particularly back in the 70s, looking at what we call an alkaline treatment of corn stalks. So what we're doing is you take ground corn stalks, you can add about 50% water, 50% dry matter, so you have to add water to it, and then you add these compounds that are alkaline that actually make the fiber in the corn stalks more digestible for the cattle. So we're using a product called calcium oxide. Calcium hydroxide would work as well, but that treatment makes the fiber more digestible as a way to try and compete with corn.
Run those numbers for me again. What percentages are you trying to feed into the diet, and what results are you getting?
What we've done around 5 or 6 times now here at the university's feedlot is we've compared feeding 5% corn stalks, which would be conventional, to 20% treated corn stalks, and getting the same performance. So basically you're able to offset 15% of your corn needs in a feedlot, which is quite economical.
Yeah, I would assume the break even has to be quite higher than, or quite lower, I guess, than what you would be normally feeding with high-priced grain.
Yeah, we're estimating, assuming corn stalks are $55 to $60 per ton, we're estimating that when you treat it, you do increase the cost, and there's a hassle factor. But you generally can make $20 to $30 more per finished animal, and that and also lower the break even.
How about that hassle factor? What all goes into adding anything you need to these ground corn stalks?
In the 5 experiments that we've done here at the university that was funded by ADM, we've actually done it, I would say, the most complicated way, but the most exact way, and that is we grind the corn stalks through a 3-inch grind, which is important. We weigh those stalks into our feed truck. We weigh out the water that goes into it. We knew how much water was in the corn stalks to begin with, and then we add this calcium oxide powder, mix it all up. Now, you wouldn't have to store it anaerobically, but we've been storing it anaerobically because we don't feed it fast enough. And so if you're going to let it sit for more than 2 weeks, it can start to spoil. But if you're going to feed it within a couple weeks, then there's no problem without storing it. You've got to let it sit for 5 to 7 days before you feed it, because that allows that reaction to occur. Now, commercially though, people don't do that. They do that a few times, and then they realize they want to try something different. And so we've had lots of ingenuity across the state and in the Midwest here on how to do that more effectively commercially. And so people have been looking at adapting their grinding equipment to where it can add the water and the calcium oxide right at the same time.
And you mentioned you're also feeding with distillers as well, trying to mix that in?
Yeah, one of the things that's really different now and makes this, we think, even more competitive is the feeding it in combination with distillers grains today is probably one of the reasons we can feed 20% treated stalks compared to 5% untreated stalks and get the same performance. So we believe that having 30 to 40% of the diet dry matter as distillers grains is a key.
If you're interested in learning more about this UNL study, the ARDC is holding a meeting on June 20th to show the economics, research data, and process of feeding residues. The meeting will also cover feeding corn silage and oil removal in distillers grains. More information on the meeting is available online at beef.unl.edu. In 2011, the U.S. sold more than $5.4 billion in beef and $6.1 billion in pork to international customers, and Nebraska Checkoff groups had a hand in those numbers. Mark Jagels, a producer from Davenport, says the state's farmers and ranchers and those across the country use Checkoff dollars to support international marketing programs. Jagels is the vice chairman of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, which organizes the export promotion activities. Jagels adds that beef and pork exported overseas equates to millions of bushels of corn and soybeans consumed. You can read more about the state's checkoff program in the May Nebraska Farmer. At the Rural Futures Conference in Lincoln this week, we talked with Tom Field. Tom is the chair of the Angler Agribusiness Entrepreneurship Program. The program started in 2010 with a $20 million gift from the Paul F. and Virginia J. Angler Foundation to the University of Nebraska. The donation provides student scholarships and program support for student courses, internship placement assistance, and more. Tom was the executive director for producer education for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association before coming to the state.
Well, it's very exciting to be in Nebraska. It's exciting because this is a state that has its eye on the future. And the opportunity to work with students at the University of Nebraska has been particularly wonderful, because I've found a tremendously visionary and very mature group of students to work with. Our program's all designed around trying to figure out ways to facilitate and mentor people so that they can create opportunities for others and so they can build communities. And the chance to be part of that is really fantastic, and in reality what we're really about is, can we support creative failure, learn from those failures, and build the future on the back of that.
Give me an example of something that the students are working on or that they have worked on in the past.
Well, we have two graduates of our program, our first two graduates, and both of them doing really interesting sorts of things. One of our students, Chase Hollebeck, is actually working on taking drone technology, a military technology, and adapting it to field surveillance to really look at crop health and crop vitality. I think that's a really creative approach to a high-tech problem, to an age-old solution, is how do we actually improve the precision work that we do in agriculture. And then Ashley Neunenkamp, who has taken a byproduct of a pumpkin processing approach and taken product that's not fit for human consumption, turned it into a new formulation and creating a sort of all-natural dog treat that sells at sort of unbelievable margins. And so it's proof that you can take a byproduct that other people would have seen as something maybe you threw away, and she saw a way to turn into something of really high value, high margin.
The clamor that you hear behind us, or that the viewer may hear behind us, is that of the Rural Futures Conference here in Lincoln. In the scope of that, what impact can the students in your program have on rural Nebraska?
Well, I absolutely believe that this generation will make or break this nation. The greatest generation, I think we've all heard about that generation that freed us from tyranny in World War II, but I think this is the next great generation, and it's a chance to take great ideas, young people who are unencumbered by place in terms of their comfort zone, people who understand that the world is a big place and that they have a role in it, and who are, by virtue of their social networking, really unencumbered by who their network is. Take those sort of characteristics, put them with the age-old belief that we can create a better future, and I think we're going to see some really amazing things happen. And what I'm excited about is that we'll not only reinvigorate, but I think reinvent not only rural Nebraska, but life in rural places all across the globe.
Now, after a mild week in Nebraska, here's UNL Extension statewide climatologist Al Dutcher to forecast the next 7 days.
Well, folks, here we are again at the beginning of a weekend, and of course during this last week we've seen some very chilly air during the early part of the week, and as the week progresses we've been gradually warming up. Now, there was some hard freeze conditions met in the northern half of the Panhandle, particularly as we got into the Tuesday morning time frame, and we've had reports of some damage to the alfalfa and suspected damage to some of the wheat that was starting to head. We followed that up on Wednesday morning with some temperatures primarily in the lower 30s to the mid 30s across the same general areas extending into the western sandhills, so we do expect there will be some residual damage, but outside of that we're not hearing much in way of significant damage. There was pockets where we got down to freezing, but it doesn't look like anything widespread in terms of rapidly wiping out some existing crops that are currently up. Now, in terms of corn planting, we hit 75% completion as of Sunday with the dry weather and the warming conditions. My suspicion is as we get into next week's release, but we'll go through Sunday, we'll essentially be at the 90% level in terms of corn planting, and in terms of soybeans we'll probably move from the lower 20s to at least 50% planted, and depending on how quickly the producers get their crops in, we could actually be approaching the 70% planted on the soybeans as we get into the Monday release, so we'll have to wait to see for that. Now in terms of our forecast, most of the moisture we're looking at is going to fall within this next 24 to 36 hour period, and after that a gradual warming trend with very warm conditions at the end of the week. So let's take a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect as we move through this 7-day period. And as we go to the upper charts, what we're looking at right now is a system that brought the cold front slowly through the state. It's kind of moving its way to the Great Lakes, and we do have it basically hanging up here in southern Nebraska, so our temperatures are going to be significantly cool with a cloudy condition. We'll be looking at highs in the mid-50s to the north, to the mid-60s across the south, and the precipitation will be coming to an end from north to south as the day progresses, and there may be a little bit of moisture residual left over across extreme southern Nebraska as we get into tomorrow morning. And by tomorrow morning, what we are going to see is that the trough itself lifts off, and we're going to start to see the warm air trying to return. So any of the moisture will kind of settle to our south. We'll start to see clearing conditions, and it's going to be a rather nice Mother's Day as we're going to be looking at highs in the east across the eastern Nebraska in the mid-60s. As we get into western Nebraska, we'll be looking at the low 70s. Now we even warm up a little bit more on Monday as the ridge starts to build into our region from the west. We're going to drop a few degrees. We're looking at highs in the low 70s across the east to the upper 70s across the west under mostly sunny skies. As we go into Tuesday, now the ridge even pushes a little bit farther into our region. The trough is still hanging off over the Great Lakes, but we're looking at highs in the mid-70s east to the mid-80s west. As we go into Wednesday, the ridge starts to take control of our region. We're looking at highs in the east across into the low 80s. In the west, we're looking at the low 90s. On Thursday, a little bit more of the same, a few more degrees, highs mid-80s east to the low 90s west. You see a trough coming in the western United States. That's going to come a little bit closer as we get into Friday, and we could see some thunderstorms developing out in western Nebraska. We're looking at highs in the upper 80s east to the mid-90s to the west. 8 to 14-day forecast keeps the warmer temperatures to our north, and in terms of precipitation, we're looking at that trough moving in, and there could be some severe weather outbreaking next weekend.
Thanks, Al. To view any interview from this or any show, you can view our website at mj.unl.edu or youtube.com/marketjournal. Next week, Mike Briggs joins us to look at cattle markets, and we'll look at transglutaminase, a protein used to bind meats and other foods. Until then, I'm Jeff Wilkerson. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.